it's really easy to turn around and say you can do everything. It's really hard to be able to turn around and say the thing that you're good at and define that and define why it is.
Thanks for coming in.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Secondly, I want to start with some basic word association.
Okay.
First thing that comes to mind, knee jerk, when I say the word recruiter.
You couldn't repeat it if I'm honest. I think a swear word would possibly come to mind. If I'm honest,
just give it to us.
I'd go professional.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So I really appreciate you coming in.
Yeah.
High level, and people will find you on LinkedIn, but very senior position. UK kind of head of for AWS on the tech side. One of the reasons that I was super keen to bring you in and to speak was I've worked with you in the past as a candidate, and placed you into roles.
Yeah.
I've also worked with you as a supplier, filling people into those roles for you.
Yeah.
You've always struck me as probably one of the most proactive people that I've ever worked with, in a sense of wanting to understand the recruitment world.
Yeah.
I remember guys that you've referred me to that I've, then gone on and placed, and you've always been very proactive from that perspective. So I'm interested to understand, you've gone professional. I'd love to know what the swear word was. But where does that come from, that perspective of over your career using recruiters, and I guess how has that added value or taken away value from you in that time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think it's one of those things. I think a lot of people don't understand recruitment and its purpose within the tech industry, especially I think sometimes tech people. I think there's definitely a view that recruiters aren't necessarily either as useful or as integral to a business as they really are. I think from my perspective, I have a very different view on that. And it's not just in recruitment, it's in everything else. So, I've led lots of different teams. I think one of the things that I find just repeatedly over every area that I go into, people often won't give the appropriate amount of respect or time to people that do different careers, as weird as it sounds. Like, I remember so I led the development business over at Accenture. And one of the big things that we did was trying to get people to understand that our operational resources and our technical resources were both doing equally hard but very, very different jobs. And I think often people look at recruitment, and the tech folk will look at recruiters and will think, oh, that's easy. Like, what are they doing? They're just taking people for lunch. They're just having a bit of a laugh. What an easy life they're doing. They're just sending CVs. What's the point of that? And then I think the recruiters will look at the tech people and think, oh, they're just geeks. Like, they're just. And I think one of the major challenges is that people don't respect other people, the unique, special skill sets they have. I think for me, why have I ended up doing it slightly different? I also think the mindset that people have is really, really important. So I do think, and it sounds kind of cheesy, but I think having this growth mindset overall is really, really important. Like, be really clear. I want to grow the pie. Like, that's my aim is everyone succeeds, everyone grows the pie together. That's the point of it. And that doesn't matter whether you're in recruitment, whether you're in sales, whether you're in technology, whether you're a customer, whether you're AWS, like whoever it is, I want it to grow. So I think one thing is really key, that I think it's understanding that the more that we all benefit together, the more that we can kind of drive the ecosystem. I think the other side as well, I think I've got probably quite a closer relationship with recruiters, partly through luck. So, if I look back, actually, my work experience, I did work experience when I was 15, and I didn't go to a particularly great school. I didn't go to a particularly great area. So I just basically picked the first place I could for work experience. And it was a bilingual recruitment company called Kerr Recruitment over in Ealing, which was an all-female bilingual recruitment company, which was.
So you slotted right in.
It was interesting. It was really, really interesting. I mean, it was the early days. So people dropped off their CVs by dropping off a paper copy of their CV. The big thing that we did is we actually did some kind of digitalization where we used a digital, and this is a really early digital camera. So we used a digital camera with a floppy disk drive that went into it, so we could associate a picture of the person with the CV. It was our kind of unique selling point, which they're very happy at me for. But I think it was one of those things. I think going through it, I try and respect everyone, and I think through that there was definitely an element of, you could see how hard these people work, you can see where the ecosystem goes, and I just think a lot of people haven't ever clicked onto that. I think there is an element that people try and be too overly transactional with recruiters. And I think that's on all different sides. I think you have candidates that basically will ignore them and will, treat them quite badly. I mean, some of the, I am amazed. I don't think a lot of tech people realize that, you know, the shit that recruiters get from people. I've seen, I don't know if I've seen the LinkedIn message on the other side with people telling recruiters, very, very nasty wording. And I think
Mm.
people don't quite realize that, honestly. And I think some of it as well, the other piece, so as a hiring manager as well, it's interesting that definitely a few years ago, so I've worked for a lot of I've worked at kind of large and small companies. There was definitely a push to, do not talk to recruiters, do not talk to a recruiter about that. It has to go through internal team. And, I totally get that, because there is an element of trying to work out with your own internal talent management. But I think fundamentally where everyone's trying to go is they're trying to build, it's trying to build talent pipelines on the recruitment side of things. So trying to work out, how can we work out for understanding business need, for understanding the right piece, how can we build that? And then the recruiters are trying to build their own talent pipelines and their own networks of people of, who is suitable. And it's the whole thing. It's a really interesting multi-dimensional, multi-sided matching game. And it's one that, the kind of the recent rise of LinkedIn and the recent rise of probably more direct, I don't think that goes, I really don't think that goes away. I think actually, if anything, as we go forward, high quality recruitment is just ever, ever more important.
Mm. There's a number of things in that I would love to touch on, and try and go in order. But the first thing you mentioned was, I think, a fundamental disconnect between tech folk who, without stereotyping too much, if you took a majority of engineers, for example, they would probably exhibit common character traits and the way they work, which is very, very different from that of someone who stereotypically would be successful in recruitment.
Yeah, 100%.
And speaking from my own perspective, the recruiters that I know, we're not massively data-driven, numbers-driven, stats-driven people. We're more humanities-based, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
So I agree that some of the vitriol that's sort of targeted at recruiters, and there's an argument to say, well, they're just doing their job and they're trying their best. I do think, though, the recruitment industry has an obligation to try and upskill itself so that when you are receiving that message, it's at least borderline relevant.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the frustration on, I guess, the candidate side of the fence of getting this, these messages, which maybe it's a bit of an overreaction, but I think there's a lot of these messages now, and the level of relevance to an individual who is used to probably operating in quite a rigorous environment where you're expected to know your shit.
Yeah.
That lack of relevance causes that reaction.
I think that, and I think also, it's interesting because I think there is the fundamental interesting challenges on recruitment because, and no offense meant, there is a low bar to being a really bad recruiter. You know, like I've definitely met the, wearing the dad's suit, really poor quality, like fake Rolex, claiming that they've got these hidden jobs. Just send your CV, just send these details over. And I think that's the problem, that it is a career in a way that it is easy. It's easy to get started badly, or at least it's easy if you turn around and go, you can turn around to go, tomorrow I'm going to be a recruiter, I'm going to do that. Most people will fail really, really badly. But I think that low barrier to entry means that you do have a pool of really not very good recruiters. And I think that is definitely something. I think also as well, you have more senior recruiters who, I just imagine it's very frustrating. I've seen people try and scale up recruitment businesses a couple of times, and it becomes very hard as well for them sometimes to get the talent they need to. So there's kind of interesting challenges within it. And then also I think fundamentally a lot of recruiters, they need to understand technology more. Like they really, it's really, really easy to go online and do, if you're recruiting into cloud, for example, you can go online, you can do an AWS cloud practitioner certification. I think it's like $50 or so, but it will give you just that kind of really basic introduction to what cloud is, to what's about. And that goes a really, really long way, because I think it's hard sometimes to respect something or respect what someone's doing with just no understanding, like zero understanding of it at all.
This for me is the biggest challenge of the industry, where you're bringing in people, and as you say, rightly so, it's a fairly low bar. So
Yeah.
I think in my first recruitment job, the only sort of hard requirement was you needed to have a minimum of a 2-1
Yeah.
in any discipline. So, you know, it's not a particularly difficult environment to
Yeah.
get into, and most firms don't even have that.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you're thrown into live scenarios with people like yourself,
Yeah.
where you're on the phone and you're trying to pitch jobs or whatever, with no comprehension of the world in which you operate.
100%.
Don't understand the basic level of technology, what these roles actually
Yeah.
do, the way organizations are structured. So one of the things we've always done and really pushed on in terms of our consultants, and it's true that it's very difficult to hire people, because we've pushed that knowledge, like build the knowledge first
Yeah.
before you worry about making placements.
Yeah.
I would be interested to understand, though, from your perspective, I'm sure you've dealt with better and worse recruiters in that regard over the years. How much does it ring through when it's just a voice on the other end of the phone? Like, does that level of knowledge, you know, is it clear and obvious? And then does it make a difference in terms of your willingness to engage with that person, or, you know, in terms of actually getting to a successful outcome, which
Yeah.
is, you know, finding you a new role if you're at that point, or
Yeah.
finding you the right talent?
So I think a lot of it. I mean, I always say to my kids, like life is a really long thing. Like it really, you know, I'm going to be working in this career and area until most likely until I die. I'll be completely honest with you. I've got no. I don't think I'd be a good retired person. I've always kind of thought that. So
Yeah.
I suspect I will do this pretty much until my day of death. And I think one of the things that's really key about all of it is having that long-term mentality around it. You know, and I think those are by far the best relationships. And I think that's both definitely on the candidate side. You know, like I've known you for, I'm trying to think how many years now, honestly.
I think it's coming up 12,
12 years. Wow.
12 years,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, it's always.
I
like-
remember the
yeah.
first time we ever spoke, because I was talking to you about a job with a company called Quantum Black, like a data
Yes,
company.
Yeah.
And I don't think it was for you. I don't think you
Yeah.
went and spoke to them, but I think we got on well, and then came back to you with the EPAM,
Yep.
which was maybe 6 months or
Yeah.
a year later. And then obviously started hiring, and, you know,
Yeah.
and in that time, you know, obviously we've.
And I think that was the, you know, for me, that was the thing. So, you know, why did it come across, and why did I initially kind of, you know, we start working together? Why did we use you as things? It's kind of an interesting thing to unpack. I think fundamentally for me, it was element of trust. I always think one of the best things is that the recruiters out there who just turn around and go, "We've got this hidden pool of talent. We've got these," and you just think, "Rubbish."
Yeah.
It's you know, like you can see how it's working. I think the trick is, I always like it when recruiters, or anyone actually for that matter, I think this goes for all the people we work with, I like it when people say no, as weird as it sounds. I like it when people turn around and you kind of go, "Well, we're looking for a role of someone doing this." Some of the best recruiters are the ones that turn around and go, "Yeah, that sounds really good, but that bit's not for me." You know, we're not you. We're a tech specialist recruiter. We can do this, and this area. We can do these fields, but you know, you've suddenly asked me for someone who is completely different area. You've suddenly asked me to try and find like an operational specialist in logistics. Like, we just don't do that, as weird as it sounds. And I think that for me is always something that's good at building trust. I think people who kind of know their limitations or know where they want to focus. I think there's always this saying of people say they want to be like laser focused on stuff. But I always think it's, you know, you kind of think of how do companies best structure themselves. The idea is you want to be a scalpel almost. You want to go for a specific area of it, and you want to know that area really, really, really well. And I think, as weird as it sounds, it's much easier to turn around and say that you're a generalist. You can do anything. You're good. You know, I'm great at AI. I do that or this. Like, it's really easy to turn around and say you can do everything. It's really hard to be able to turn around and say the thing that you're good at and define that and define why it is. And I think those are the companies that are really good. And then I think on the flip side, where it works really well is the more that you can get integrated into the rhythm of the business. And that's really the best, I think, recruitment, where, you know, you should understand what the company's like, how the culture works. Like, there are definitely different cultures between business. I mean, I've worked a number of different places, and, you know, there's vastly different cultures in my ways. And culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I really do agree with that. So you want to understand the culture of the business, and all of that is long-term, interesting relationships where both people put time and effort in, and it stays for the long term. And like that's really well, I think that where I think the benefit for everyone kind of comes in.
Mm. I think there's a couple of things to give I guess a recruiter's perspective on, but I agree the being laser focused and having a specialization
Yeah.
is really important from a perspective of like how much value can you add. But there is a tendency on the recruitment side of the fence to say, oh yeah, we're specialists at that as well, and that's a mindset thing that comes particularly in larger companies where you turn up and it's like you don't say no to work it out. And it doesn't really translate when you get beyond kind of lower level transactional
Yeah.
hiring and you
Yeah.
actually get into, I need a real A player to come in that has a very specific skill set.
Yeah.
And I think that is a gap in the industry where perhaps there's a bit of a blind spot for agencies where they just think more is better all the time. And actually, in reality, the job of an agency, as I see it, if you're going to go to market to hire, is to save you time. Because you could go and do it all on LinkedIn or whatever if you wanted to, but it would take a lot of time to do and it's a lot of hurdles for you to jump. But the value of an agency is not sending loads of CVs, and it's sending maybe 3 and saying, look, these are all relevant. So if you speak to these 3 people, I can't technically test them, but I can test them from a culture fit. If I understand your culture, one of them is going to be there or thereabouts. And for you as a busy, person in your role where recruitment's not the day job, you're now not spending so much time trying to deal with these issues. The second point of that, though, is that requires a degree of input at the beginning. And one of the trends in recent years, and it'd be good to get your opinion on this, is a lot of bigger companies want to centralize how they recruit to an internal team where it's very frowned upon as an agency if one of those central teams find out that you and I had spoken directly and it wasn't in a properly organized conference call with lots of agencies on it and all this stuff. So how is that impacting your ability to actually get the most out of the agency partners that you do have, or even internal teams?
Yeah. So I think there's almost kind of stepping back into it. I think one thing that's key is, do you want to be, do firms want to, or do consult how it works out? Do they want to be recruitment companies or do they want to be talent development? And I think there is a massive, massive difference between just the, get on the phone, lob a load of CVs in, to the companies that work really, really well in this kind of symbiotic side of things and actually grow the business in a way that maybe the business wouldn't have thought of. I think sometimes, going down to your point of giving like limited number of CVs, completely agree. There is no just sending over a load of CVs. There's value in it, but there's very little value. You can do it yourself. I think some of the best agencies I've worked with, actually, I think over the years, this one I would definitely say about yourself, are the ones that have been able to offer sometimes challenging candidates, as weird as it sounds. Like, it's the candidates you wouldn't necessarily think of, but end up being really, really, really good sometimes. And I think that's a key piece to that whole, it's almost, how do you help jointly develop a talent strategy with someone else? And I think coming on to the second point, that's where it becomes harder. I do think it's interesting because you can definitely see the increasing centralization of recruitment that's been happening across the whole industry. And it's most places, large and small, and I understand the rationale, definitely understand the rationale behind that. And you can see from a financial perspective, some of the reasons behind, like recruitment fees are non-inconsiderable. How you start to manage that, I do think it is really important to view the recruitment agencies or recruitment consultancies you work with as an extension of the team. I think that's the fundamental thing. I think that ideally what you end up with is your kind of internal pool and a small limited pool of partners that you work with. And I think that's, it goes across everything. If you think how we, so, when we're looking at cloud migrations with people, we have a number of different partners, and that's everything from the big GSIs in the world to the smaller boutiques to, the kind of ones in the middle of it. But what we try and do is we try and almost go to a smaller number of those, so a sensible number that you can have a relationship with, that you can have trust with, and that are trusted to deliver on certain areas of it. And I think the more that you can kind of pull those into your business planning process, the better. Like I was talking with a partner the other night, and they're looking at hiring a load of people. They've got a load of interesting work going on, and they were kind of saying, how do we do? We've got this big piece of work coming down the pipeline that is a significant large piece of work that may or may not come off. That's the reality of it. So they're in a kind of interesting point from a talent perspective where they need to start thinking, how do they warm up that talent? But how do they get to a point where if that work comes off, they can deliver it quickly? And my advice to all of them is to have recruitment partners you work with really closely. Like that's the way to do it. That's the way I think that's just the optimal way to do it. Then as long as you trust them, at the end of the day, like there has to be trust on both sides, because there has to be the ability to say, Craig, there's these roles, this might not turn up, like this is what's happening, but this is what I think. And I think that's a really, really useful thing.
And for the agency, when they get that sort of buy-in in terms of they're part of the conversation, you then get so much more commitment from them.
Yeah.
Because they see the value of, okay, even if this work doesn't come off, these are people we can work with that want to proactively engage with us.
100%.
And that concept of being an extension of the brand is important, because if I'm recruiting on behalf of you, for example, you need to know that the people that I'm messaging, people that I'm calling, headhunting, asking for referrals, all this stuff, when I get on the phone to them, I can actually articulate what the offering is and why should this person consider it, and why is it worth a chat. But also that then I'm going to engage with them throughout the process in a way that is a positive representation of the business, i.e. giving them feedback, giving them proper kind of help and preparation with regard to interviews, a bit of kind of hand holding through the process, doing a full, consultative, I guess, job. And there does seem to be sometimes in that scenario where you maybe have tech leaders that are saying, right, we've got this bit of work, we need to go to market, we don't really know how to do it. There's always a sense of more is better, get more agencies. And actually, from an agency perspective, I think that's probably the worst thing to do, because people kind of lose interest a little bit and it becomes a race to the bottom, and they don't spend the time actually engaging the right people, because it's just about, I've got to either outcompete against these people, so I've got to speak to as many people as quickly as I can, or it's, I'm going to go and focus on this piece of work over here.
So it's interesting. So there was a fantastic podcast with one of the CEOs from Anthropic, the AI company, recently, and he was talking about their view of AI safety and how you change the market in the AI market. One of the things that he said that I thought was just really, really good. So they are trying to make AI a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. If that makes sense. And I think you sum it up really well. I think the challenge you get if you're just chucking bodies into the mix, and if that's in terms of either number of recruitment agencies, people you're throwing at it, like you end up with this kind of race to the bottom that no one wins from, if I'm completely honest with you. I really don't think anyone does. Whereas I think if you can commit to limited numbers or small relationships, and you can kind of double down on the ones that work, like that's where I think you start to get real benefit around it, actually. And I really do. And I think, in the end of the day, like that takes people to commit. It takes people to turn around and actually say, I'm willing to be wrong on this. And you can always change your mind. Like if you commit with an agency and you go through and it doesn't work and you find afterwards, then that's fine. Like that's the reality of it. You can turn around. And I think as long as you kind of can turn around and say, well, this is why I did it. I think the worst ones are this scattergun approach. And we did it. So at Accenture, we hired really, really dramatically, and we did some of that direct, some of that via agencies. And a lot of that came down to committing to small numbers, to effectively having trust within them. If they worked out, perfect. If they didn't work out, we'd discuss and we'd kind of do something else. But I think that comes down to that committing, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's common sense, in a sense of, if you were going to buy a house, you wouldn't want to have 17 different estate agents that you were trying to deal with. You would try and find one or two that you felt understood, the market, understood what you wanted, had a serious conversation with you about it, was working on your behalf.
Yeah.
To then go to market. But then if that is common sense and it does generate results, why, in your opinion, is so much of the industry still in that more is better, let's just scattergun it, get 6 or 7 agencies on it, hope for the best?
So I think to an extent, actually, there's a large, I like the recruitment, the housing side of things is a really good analogy, because I think it's also one where sometimes the underlying motives are quite unclear effectively. Like, there's really interesting things of, people do, I think, sometimes have a bit of a distrust for estate agents, I think quite unfairly, honestly. Like, again, they're extraordinarily important thing within the ecosystem. Like, it's these these interesting things that if all the estate agents disappeared, like
Yeah.
it'd be really problematic. Like be
Yeah.
really, really clear about that. But equally, people often don't necessarily have the trust around it. With them, I think it's because people don't trust what their motives are. You know, there's this kind of inherent distrust of, well, they're just trying to sell it. They don't care. They don't care about this. And you could kind of argue, actually, to an extent, do they really care about getting an extra 10 grand for your house or not? You know, I could argue that from a percentage wise, actually, that's probably very little. And I think, see, people end up distrusting them. And I think that's the same sometimes with recruitment. Like, you know, one of the things I don't think people, I think most candidates genuinely have no idea how the economics of recruitment agencies work. I mean, at all, as in into a really, really bizarre degree of they don't understand how they're paid. They've never asked as well. Like, I find that a really weird thing that, you know, it's good if you're working with someone over a long period of time.
Yeah.
It's good to ask them how they're getting paid. Like, you know, that's not a thing. I mean, you know, that's not a thing you can't do, if that makes sense.
Whose side are you on here?
Yeah, exactly. And like, it sounds
Are you motivated to push me down on my money or to push me up?
Exactly. And I think people just don't ask that. And I find that such a weird thing that, like, if you're going to work with someone for, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds, like, you can turn around and say, well, like, how does this work? Like, you know, and not in a, I'm not definitely not saying in an aggressive way to turn around and be like, you know, you're not trying to do that. You're just trying to understand where the incentives align. Like, you know, I'm a firm believer, like the places I like working best are where you can align everyone's incentives in the right way. So what you want to get to a situation is where you are successful, recruiter is successful, end company, like, you want to align those incentives. And I think a lot of that comes around understanding what those incentives are. And I think that's the other way around. I think, you know, I often think you get on the actual hiring manager side, I don't think they sometimes understand how this works either. Like, it's a really weird, opaque market. And I think the more that everyone can kind of be open and transparent and kind of, you know, start to try and understand, like, this is how it works. Like, that's how you breed trust. That's how you breed the long-term relationships.
This is a conversation I have with my teams all the time, in a sense of, we do this every day. So there is sometimes, I think, a tendency to be a little bit flippant about interviews, offers, counter offers, because it's all just the same stuff for us. And you've got to remember that if you're dealing with someone who hasn't moved jobs for 5 years, maybe they've dipped their toe in a little bit in that time, but they can probably count on one hand the number of interviews they've done over the last 5 years. And they've definitely can count on one hand the amount of times they've been in the situation of having to negotiate money.
Yeah.
And that sense of understanding, like, a job move is really important. Like, it's a really big thing. And it impacts family and, you know, and lifestyle and progression and everything else. And not having that respect on the agency side for the candidate of what they're going through at that point, where they're like, look, hold on a minute. Like, I'm just trying to make the best decision for me.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to work out what that is. I don't really need you in my ear. And I don't know whether what you're telling me is for my good or for your good, because I don't understand how it works. And there is a bit of a disconnect there. And I think that's something that agencies maybe would be beneficial to say, look, mate, full disclosure, the more money you earn, the more money we earn.
Yeah.
But we would much rather earn less money and you get the job than over negotiate. You don't get the offer and then we all end up with nothing.
That, and I think also people realizing that, you know, you want to hire people that stay in that job. Like, like, most times there is a time where recruiters, if someone's there, they are not the right person in the job and they either leave because it's not right for them or it's not right for like, no one gets paid. Like, that is like pure market failure, effectively. So, you know, it is that working out, how do you start to bring things together? And again, I think it comes back almost to the initial point. I think, like, I am a firm believer in this whole trying to work out what it's like in the other person's shoes perspective in so many things in life, because I just think it's like being a recruiter is a really hard job. It's like a super hard, stressful, like, difficult job. And I think you have a lot of people that don't quite realize what's going on around all of that.
No, it's difficult. It is a hard job, but I do think also the recruiter has the obligation to appreciate the complexity of the situation that their stakeholders are navigating, where as a hiring manager, recruitment's not your day job.
Yep.
So you're having to work that in around what the day job is. And as a candidate, you've still got a day job,
Yeah.
but now you're trying to do interviews.
Yeah.
And maybe you're doing them in the evenings and you're tired. And maybe you've kind of gone into this process because it sounded great, but now it's playing out and you're in like round 4 and you're a little bit like, oh, I'm not sure I actually really want to do this anymore. And then you've got this entity in the middle where, you know, if
you don't necessarily trust the entity in the middle.
no, and if they handle it wrongly,
Yeah.
they can seem to be, you know, bad actors, or they can seem to be quite pushy, or, you know, and there is that sense of, like you say, the respect of kind of all the stakeholders, of understanding where the, you know, like it's all just people trying to make the best decision at the end of the day, and trying to do a good job. But
And I think to your point earlier, I think also, you know, you get a lot of people that in the whole. I mean, I've done contract. I've probably done slightly more jobs than some other people did. And I thought contracting for me was really fun, actually, if I'm honest. I think it's interesting that when I started my career, I remember someone saying, you know, you can't move around. You've got to stay like 5 years in a job, always stay 5 years in a job. Otherwise, you know, no one will ever hire you. And it turns out actually now the world has moved on a bit. I think that's the right thing, if I'm honest. I think people are more understanding of flexible movement. But it is true. There's a load of people who they will only in their lifetime ever have literally a handful of jobs, like 4 or 5 jobs. You know, they might only interview 6, 7 times within it. Like, it's a really scary thing. And I think, you know, there is, like, I always think this with, like, I manage moderately large team now, I have before. Like, it is as weird as it sounds. I like leading people. Actually, I genuinely like leading stuff. I find it quite fun. I try and do the right thing. I think a lot of people forget how serious that is for people's lives. You know, the job that they get or how they perform in work has, you know, serious implications on their happiness, their health, their overall mortality rate, like how long they're going to live, as crazy as it sounds. Like, this is like really, really serious stuff. And I definitely think as well over time, you know, there's different people are better suited to different things. That's just, and companies are very, very different. So that whole kind of how you do that optimal matching is so important. And it's going to be really interesting where it goes. I always like the Future. Have you watched Futurama? Where they start Futurama, Matt Groening, fantastic. First episode comes in, and they have Fry wakes up after being asleep for 1,000 years or so, and they go in and they do a DNA test on him, and they go, right, so we've decided your job, you're going to be a delivery boy. This is what you're designed for. And he kind of backs out of this. He hates the whole thing. He runs this kind of like interesting like chase around it effectively. And at the end of it, eventually he kind of goes to a position where he can actually pick what he wants to do. And the thing that he picks is being a delivery boy. Right. And it's really interesting that kind of getting to a position where people feel that they've got agency to choose the right thing for them, but equally comes with the input of someone else. Like, the best recruiters, to a large extent, are the ones who can turn around and go, actually, this is the role you'd be perfect for. Like, the reason we know you're only going to interview a handful of times. Like, this is the one that you should spend time on because we understand you, we understand the business. Like, and it's not just money. Like, money doesn't really matter. I've realized in life, like it's an important thing, but it's not the be all and end all.
Yeah, I think on the money piece, like, people don't move jobs for money. Yeah. They just have an expectation that for me to move jobs, I should get a bit more money. But it's not. Sometimes you get rare scenarios where there's a really hard financial, you know, I need to get this, but that's very, very rare. Which is why I find counter offers really fascinating.
Yeah.
Because people come to the table not based on money.
Yeah.
But then they get counter offered to match the money. And they go, oh, well, they've matched my money, so I'm going to stay. And it's like, okay, but does that address the reasons that you actually wanted to move in the first place? Or is it that actually you're just a little bit uncomfortable having quite a difficult conversation with people that you've worked with for a long time and you don't want to let them down, you don't disappoint them? It's not the nicest thing to do. And that's just a bit of an easy way out where you might end up regretting that decision, you know, when the dust has settled.
I think there's so much around loss aversion. I think it's really interesting that people will value things that they feel they have at the moment higher than things that they may have in the future, as weird as it sounds. And I do think there is an element definitely of people changing their mind within roles because as soon as that, what ends up happening is that counter offer comes in, it gives them a kind of little bit of a push, and actually what they're doing is they're rating lots of the things they had currently higher than maybe they would. I think that it's always really interesting. I think one of the things that people should always think about is it's not people need to be in the right places for them. But I think always one of the keys to think about, or like I would try and think about, is if you were offered this package, role, all of it, knowing what you know now, and you imagine you don't have the job now, if that makes sense. Like let's not think of a counter offer as I've got the job and they're giving me something else. Almost think of it, okay, you're sitting there, you have no job, you've got two options for that. One is maybe the job that you've got at the moment, but these are the effectively what it's going to be doing. This is the monetary thing, and the other is the new role within it. But think of both of you as having neither, if that makes sense. I think people do end up with this whole like loss aversion or like chasing losses. It's super interesting.
It always reminds me, without I don't want to trivialize it, but it reminds me of the kid doing the nativity that's really happy to do it all the way through the rehearsals, and then they're in the car on the way, and now it's like, oh shit, this is real.
Yeah,
I've got a stomachache.
yeah,
and the parents at that point will go, yeah, you're doing it.
Yeah.
And then they'll do it and they'll realize, oh, I do remember the lines. And then everyone will applaud them and they'll come off and they'll go, my kids do this all the time. Oh, I can't wait to do that again. But it's the fear of the unknown a little bit.
100%.
And, I do think that comes into it where with counters in particular, people lose a lot of the cold, hard facts.
Yeah.
And they become much more emotional.
Yeah.
And it's just that sense of that positive paranoia of, I have this and I'm not happy, but I'm maybe comfortable. The risk of I do this where I might find something that makes me a bit more happy, but it might not.
So I'd be really interested, and you'll know this much better than me. I would be really interested to know the different dynamics of accepting counter offers with being purely virtual, because I do think it's interesting when you think about like what makes you accept or not accept a job. It is a strange situation now that we're going back into the office a lot more, which is a good thing. I do think actually, and I completely get why some people want to be completely virtual. I every different companies, different things. I like seeing people in person, like stuff like this. It's much better doing this in person. Quite honestly, I like stuff in person, and I do think it's interesting still that looking at recruitment processes, there's loads of companies out there that are now in the office, but their recruitment is still completely virtual.
Yeah,
which seems bonkers to me. And then I do wonder off the back of that, I suspect that the chances of backing out for those become much higher because you feel like you've given less by you never even met these people.
Counters are up.
Yeah,
everywhere.
This is what I would.
And part of it is the virtualization of the process where there's a value to like seeing the whites of someone's eyes.
100%.
I think for a lot of people when they move jobs, it comes down a little bit to trust.
Yeah.
Are they going to bin the project in a year's time? Are there going to be people there that, I'm going to work with and I'm not going to get on with that I haven't met or whatever? It's the fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of value in body language and shaking someone's hand and feeling like, do we share, the same values and are we aligned? And culturally, does this make sense for me? And it's really hard to get that on the other end of a computer screen.
Yeah.
I know one argument of why a lot of these processes are still quite virtual is it's a lot easier to get people to do interviews because you're not having to find an excuse to get out of the office. You don't need to do the dentist appointment or whatever. You're not traveling across London. Maybe you're in the city. You've got to get into the West End or whatever. It's a lot more convenient to find a room and sit on a call. But then you do pay a price at the end. And anecdotally, like we're seeing the feedback on the rise where people are getting to offer stage and they're sort of going, I don't really understand what this job's going to do.
Yeah.
And I don't really understand why they're hiring this role. And I don't really know who I'm going to be reporting into. And actually the tangibles are all still the same, but those intangibles, the emotional side of it is like, I don't feel an attachment to these people and I don't buy into them so much. And they're offering me great things, but then I've also got this thing over here that will kind of do the same thing for me now. And I do know them. And that does count for something.
And this is why it seems kind of bonkers to me that, the most important things you can do as a business is hiring the right people. Like that is, I know it sounds really obvious, but like companies are made up of people. That is it. And so what you want to do is hire the best people, the most suited folk for it. And so to do that, you want to spend a load more time on the whole recruitment process than anything else. Like you really do. And physically asking people to come into the office, like if they turn around and say, I don't want to do that because X, Y, Z, well, not saying like maybe they're the wrong people, but like you want someone who cares because
Yeah.
like and from a psychology perspective as well, going back to almost that loss aversion, they've then kind of leaned into it. And then from a candidate side, so like I've done consulting for years before this. Like I used to really like walking into offices. I much preferred doing meetings in person. And that wasn't for any kind of like nefarious reasons. It's just because you can work out, I think, moderately quickly. Once you go into an office, you can kind of work out a bit. There is definitely this element of how it works. You can feel like it's all a bit harder because there's more people who are remote now and it's all a bit more complex. But you could kind of like, you'd walk in and you could, like, there was one place I went into that was definitely unnamed. And middle of the day, everyone's just like looking at the Daily Mail or shopping or doing stuff that over over screens. Went into a long meeting with the customer, came back out at like 3:30, and the office had emptied out and everyone had gone home. And you kind of get the impression of, okay, well, I know you kind of
high performance.
This is not necessarily a high performing place, effectively, which was for a lot of people that worked there were really, really happy about it, and good things, and they've kind of done what they've done. But I think you want to know that because like I want to go in somewhere. I'm a high energy person, I work really hard. I want to see what I can do. And so I want to go into somewhere and see it being this high energy. And I think that's, I'm guessing with a lot of other candidates, they want to go in and feel it's like that. So I really do think like places need to go back to recruiting in person. It's just, it seems such an obvious thing for like all sides of the equation. And, I know there's some people who, it's different. If you want to do a job and it's 100% remote, and there's a load of engineers out there that have now, sworn blind, they're never going to leave the house ever again until, the end of time. And I totally get that. So, I see for those, yeah, absolutely fine. But, your interview process should mirror to an extent the job that you're going to do. So if you're going to do it, if you're hiring for a role where people are expected to be in the office a fair bit of the time and home a bit of the time, well, then your interview process should have some in person, some remote. Like, it sounds really obvious, but I don't think anyone's, I don't know.
How do you think the work from home stuff plays out? Because there's been a real shift this year where, just my opinion, but a lot of better companies are pulling people back in. Firms that are maybe not considered, and I think that's applicable across big tech, banks, hedge funds, the bigger names are pulling people back. Maybe more of the middle ground names are trying to compete a little bit on flexibility to say, can we go and get some of these people that would normally be in these ultra high performing environments? And then it's got a little bit tribal on the candidate side of the fence or the individual where it's, I'm in office or I'm out or I have to have this and et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of kind of pitch battles going on. Fast forward a year, how do you think that side of it continues to evolve?
It's weird because I feel I do, like I've always done the same thing for a really long period of time, which is basically be where I need to be. So I find it is really interesting, the polarization that has gone on over the last few years. And I do wonder to an extent whether some of that is at the fault of the social media companies. Like it's, a lot of work is around LinkedIn now. Like LinkedIn has become like, as the social networks go, like LinkedIn has become this like absolute like behemoth around it. It really is. It like blows my mind. It really, really does. And I do wonder whether some of that kind of echo chamber effect that happened in Facebook a while back, that there was, the various people there was, all various investigations happened around it. I do wonder whether some of that has occurred in the kind of the professional social network about being remote, not being remote. And I do wonder whether that is an underlying reason for it, actually.
There are times, I'll admit, where I just fancy a bit of a Barney, a bit of online confrontation.
Nah, I can't imagine this.
My go-to is say something about work from home.
Yeah.
But it's always, the engagement are from the same people and they're always banging the same drum. And actually, in the real world, when I'm talking to people, the question of work from home never really comes up anymore. I
Yeah.
think there's been an acceptance, certainly in the higher levels of people that maybe want to work in those better environments where it's renormalizing.
Yeah.
The biggest challenge is people that have joined the industry post 2020, where they've not really known the in office.
Yeah.
And those are harder conversations to have. But there are some people that are senior, very experienced people that would certainly remember the world of
Those
pre-COVID.
heady days of 2019.
But a conversation like I have with people is, think back 2019, 2018,
Yeah.
2017. Did you work 5 days in the office?
Yeah.
No. I had flexibility, but it was ad hoc. It was
Yeah.
a discretionary deal
Yeah.
that I worked out with my manager. Okay. Did your contract say 5 days a week in the office? Yes. Right. So that's sort of the world where it seems to be now, but everyone's going, well, what does it say in the contract in terms of days? And I'm like, well, it says 5.
Yeah.
But in the real world, it doesn't. You wouldn't retain people without some flexibility. But you can't have we're 3 days a week, because if you need to get someone to do a 4th day, that could become quite tricky, depending on the attitude of that person.
This is the thing. So, if I think back to my time working in investment banking back in, this is going back a long time, like back into 2012 or so.
So you were Deutsche, right?
So I was at Deutsche. I've been in Deutsche, Credit Suisse, Goldman's,
Standard Chartered.
Standard Chartered. Yeah. Most of those I would work a day or two from home. Like that's kind of what I've always just done, and it was just, I did that because that was a sensible thing to do. Other people did that. I think it is interesting that I think some of it comes down to not necessarily try. I think one weird thing. I think as a world, we've got to admit that we did go through this like crazy thing over the last year. Like effectively, people. I still remember Boris Johnson on the thing saying that this is instruction. You cannot leave your house.
But I remember talking to you early doors.
Yeah.
And you were saying to me, this is going to be really big.
Yeah.
This was beginning of 2020.
Yeah.
And I think I was it was still a long way away. And I was a little bit like, no, this is another SARS.
I like data, man.
This is SARS or whatever. Like, there's all the chat. But and I remember you saying to me, this is a big deal.
Yeah.
And I think you said sort of my advice to you is like, treat it like it's a big deal. But it has created, I think, so much confusion on the company side of like, how do we now navigate? I remember I met a CIO maybe in like 21, and we were talking about this stuff. And he was like, we really want people back in the office because we're losing our culture.
Yeah.
And we're losing our identity as a firm. And when we don't have a central culture, new cultures are just going to spring up, but they're going to be different everywhere. Yeah. And he said also, we're finding that it's really hard to upskill people because they're good at what they do. They're a hedge fund, smaller environment where they need people to constantly be doing new stuff. And he's like, we're struggling to get the same rate of progression in terms of a professional skill set than we used to get. But we don't know how to even broach coming back in a way that retains. We're worried about losing talent, and I think it's really to your point, it's been much bigger maybe than a lot of people give it credit for in that regard.
I think also as well, like if I look back at my career, genuinely, there are such big things that I would have missed if I hadn't been in the office. Like, like we were talking before this about what I did over the summer. I went to Ibiza with a couple of friends. Like one of them is someone who was my old boss at London Stock Exchange many moons ago.
Yeah.
And effectively, like I still know I'm friends with all of these people. I've ended up with like a better life as a result of knowing all these folks. And do I think that would have happened if I'd been completely remote? I don't know if it would have. If I'm totally honest with you, I think, it's far more like, would I have ended up in relationships with these people? Yeah, I mean, like I met my wife through like one of my work friends at Ladbrokes many years ago. And if I'd been completely remote, would I have ended up doing that? Probably not.
Yeah.
Like, especially as an IT person, like, I was a Unix sysadmin at the moment, which you may think is dynamic, outgoing, area of things. But isn't always as much, quite honestly. And so I think there is this, I think often, bad as it sounds, I think sometimes what people think they want isn't necessarily always the best for them.
Well, this is another point where it ties in quite nicely to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the centralization of recruitment.
Yeah.
Now everyone's pushing referrals
Yeah.
internally.
Yeah.
But if you work remotely with people, how confident are you going to be in referring someone that you've not actually been in the trenches with? So companies are saying to us, our agency spend is through the roof,
Yeah.
but we want referrals. So there's a role.
Yeah.
We're going to give it to you in 2 weeks,
Yeah.
but we're going to spend 2 weeks, first of all, trying to get referrals or whatever. And 99 times out of 100, 2 weeks go by. Yeah, we haven't got anywhere. We need you. But I think one of the big reasons why is people are now a bit more reluctant to vouch for and put their neck on the line and say, this person's great, when actually the relationship with that person is fragmented because it's now predominantly remote.
I do think the over-reliance on referrals is probably a really bad thing, if I'm completely honest with you. Like, I was reading a stat, I read it the other day, about the nepotistic nature of business, and that actually business is becoming more and more nepotistic than it ever was before, which is something that, like, I come from like a diverse background. I grew up in a not particularly great place in the world, so I've not made any of this through the friends I made at school, put it that way. Like, I've done it through like hard graft over the years. And it does worry me, this kind of more and more push of the people you should be hiring are the people that people refer in. I just think that does give me this kind of echo chamber vibes. So I don't think that's not how it used to be. Like, as weird as it sounds, in any way, shape, or form. And I do think as well, like, you sometimes see on like you see on LinkedIn sometimes, like, how many people have applied for some of these jobs, and it's like bonkers. I mean, someone sent me one the other day, and they're like, look at this, and I think it had like it'd been open for a day and a bit, and had 2,000 people applied for this thing. Where'd you start? Yeah. Like, there's just no way. So then you kind of go, okay, well, the way we're going to filter this, what we're going to do, we're going to look for referrals. So we're going to go to people working there at the moment, and we're going to look at those referrals. And obviously, we're not going to chuck all those CVs in the bin, but we're going to use some like either ATS or like applicant tracking stuff, which again I have kind of views on.
Yeah.
So we're going to go through that, and we're just going to focus on the referrals. But like, the problem is, if you're just focusing on the referrals, you're not growing that talent pool.
No.
Like, you're just not.
But you also create like sort of a replica of another environment in yours. We started working with a fund last year who'd hired a couple of MDs that come out of Goldman on the tech side.
Yeah.
And we knew, because they'd said a few things of like, we just need to go and find Goldman people. We'll make loads of placements.
Yeah.
And if it's not Goldman, there'll be JP.
Yeah.
Because that's all they wanted. And I don't know the motivation behind it, whether it was they just had too much volume, so there was just like a confirmation bias or whatever. But essentially, anyone that was from a big American bulge bracket bank that had the word Goldman or Morgan in it, they hired. But anyone who was rolling out of a Barclays or somewhere like that, they didn't. But you could see it in, we do a lot. I say we're not data-driven people. I'm becoming more data-driven. And we look a lot at our metrics.
Yeah.
And the ratio of CV to interview, there was such a disparity when in the reality is we're neutral in terms of how we were evaluating those CVs. And we are limited to an extent as I think probably we know more than a lot of agencies technically, but we're not engineers.
Yeah.
So there's almost that kind of pure objectivity to it where all these people should be roughly as good as each other because we vetted them in the same way. And it was hugely skewed. And then you could see it coming, but like 9 months later, it was like, we really need to hire some people that aren't from big American banks because we're basically, but now that affects the ability to get new candidates because they're going and interviewing, going, everyone's ex-Goldman here or ex-JP Morgan. I'm not.
Yeah.
I worry for my future progression opportunity in that environment. And it really harmed their onward talent acquisition just because it was like, as a candidate on the outside looking in, that's something maybe you'd be a little bit wary of if you're not, in the club, so to speak.
And I think it comes down to like, diversity is really, 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 really important. And like, not for, as bad as it sounds, not for any kind of box ticking exercise. I think there is so much value in having diverse teams. And that's in all kind of different directions in terms of gender. I do a lot of stuff. I mean, I'm really dyslexic, so like, I always fly that flag. So like in terms of neurodiversity, in terms of socioeconomic grouping, in terms of upbringing. And like, why is that? Well, I just think you end up with better teams as a result of it. And I think if you go down a point where you will only hire people who've either worked in one area or they've got people they know people effectively from that area. I just think it's just interesting dead ends, and I think that's to an extent. I think that's where the over reliance on referrals end up.
Mm.
It really does, and like it's also interesting seeing how I'd love to plot on a graph of where, and I suspect there's a couple of people putting loads of referrals into a lot of companies. I think there's people almost running their own like pseudo recruitment businesses internally. Is probably how it works to an extent. And does that get the best out of the company? And also as well, there's also this certain thing where, should you think more of a candidate because they've been referred by someone internally or not? Or is it better from the outset to try and, go on that? Like, how do you assess them? And I think it is a challenge over relying on referrals. I really do.
It seems to me as someone on the outside of companies trying to help them hire, it always seems to me a little bit like companies are kind of making it up as they're going along a little bit, where it's they put out a JD that's maybe the same one that they used a year ago when they last hired with a couple of extra words on it.
People don't. I mean, yeah, we obviously spend a load of time on job descriptions, but it amazes me of how. I mean, you see this one, I think, just how little like that. That's
how rubbish they are.
How rubbish they are. How little people care about it. How like and it seems crazy because like you're gonna have to, whoever you get from this. Like that is the most important thing, especially if you've got if you've got like a team of 10 people, like adding the 11, that's like a 10
big deal.
Yeah, that's like a 10% uplift in your workforce. So that's a really, really big deal. That makes more of a difference than pretty much anything you can do. Like, how do you get that done at the first point? Well, you write a high quality job description. And it's interesting. I'd love to know, and I'm sure I could bet, the amount of generative AI that is being used now to write job descriptions. I suspect it's extraordinarily high. If I'm honest, I think that's probably.
Well, one person said to me that a generative AI with some basic context can write a better JD than he can, and he's hiring for the role. Question that was interesting for me is, when you look back at people you've hired, do you hire more on tangible skill versus the qualitative in the gaps? You just get the sense that this person is the right person.
Yeah.
Which one weighs more heavily in terms of how you make decisions on who you want to hire?
So it's all a bit of both. I mean, I think some of the best people I've ever hired, have been the ones that I've really had to convince other people around me we should hire them. They by a long way. And they've also been the worst. So, be transparent. Like there's people I've mishired that looking back I shouldn't have hired, and actually it's interesting, I should have learned from that. But I think genuinely some of the people that I've there's someone I work with at the moment who's just absolutely fantastic, and they didn't have actually a load of the skills really that they probably not they kind of needed. If you just done it by the JD, they wouldn't have got the job at all. But you could see actually it was the kind of what's behind the requirement of those skills. And one of the key things at Amazon is it's cultural fit. It's the fact you need to own the business. You need to feel like this is your business. You can go and do what you want with it. You need to be an owner effectively. And like you looked at that person's background and you could see that's what they'd done. Like they'd done it something different. So I think some of the best people to hire are the ones often that you wouldn't necessarily expect to go in. And and I'm really this whole just getting someone who's done the job before. Well, is that what you really want?
Maybe if you're hiring contractors.
Maybe you're hiring contractors. Yeah, I think these transactional things, like if I want someone who's, integrated a CI/CD environment, do I just want someone who's done it somewhere else? Yeah, maybe. I can kind of understand that. But that's the really interesting thing about work is it's so interesting when you look at how it actually works. Like it is all a game in a way. It's just a game where we're really unsure of the rules. So it's like this, it's kind of almost there's a fantastic book out there called Range, which looks at different people over the years, what they've done, where they got good. One of the examples that people often talk about is the Tiger Woods kind of Tiger Mother thing, where, but really early age, doing golf from the start, Tiger Woods, fantastic, one of the world's best ever golfers. And that's a sport actually where, it is really simplistic. Like the rules of golf are pretty simple. They are whack the ball, get ball in hole. I know there's a load of complexities around it, but it's pretty easy in terms of the feedback. it's interesting when you look at Roger Federer. Like Roger Federer, absolutely unbelievably good tennis player, like world's best for many, many years. You look at his upbringing, and actually, he didn't really go into tennis until he was like 17 or so. Before that, he did, I think it was basketball. He's done loads of other sports. He's done this really complex things. And part of it comes down to that when you look at tennis as a sport, it's really complex. It's a really, really complex sport to actually play. And I think the parallels for me into business is this unbelievably interesting, multi-dimensional kind of thing to get good at. And so I think some of the best people that that people can hire, and it comes down to what you want, are the ones that have those interesting things. They've picked up different things. They've gone for different skill sets. Like, the one thing that I can say categorically, the world of business will be dramatically different in 2 to 5 years from how it is now. So if you're just looking at someone who can basically just do the last 5 years and can do the last 5 years again, that's probably not the skill sets that we need, honestly.
Which then begs the question, is writing a job description the best way to hire people? Because you're breaking something down to just, as especially if you're using agencies, go and find me people that have done this before, is a better route for companies that are maybe, and I saw a great stat the other day that PwC had, I think it was in 2023, they completed a study of Fortune 500 CEOs, and 92% of them listed talent acquisition as their number one challenge. So it's very important. It's a big deal. And I agree that good hires aren't always the best hire on paper.
Yeah.
They're the people that bring the right things to the table. Should the industry try and shift more towards let's actually, the example you gave earlier, bring a couple of agencies in, make them part of the process, give them a steer on why this is important to us, be honest with them, engage them in a way where they have the answers and they actually can understand these are the tangible points that we kind of need someone to have.
Yeah.
These are the real intrinsic skills that's going to dictate who that right person is. And we can move away a little bit from, just here's an arbitrary set of skills on a job description where even by their own admission, sometimes the people writing them don't feel they're the best people to write them, because it's really hard to capture what you're actually looking for, especially when people have left. Because I think in any role, you bring someone in, but say they're there for 3 years, that role is going to have organically grown into being a very unique role within your organization based on the culture of your organization. So to try and hire someone into that with a mirror match of that skill set is going to be really hard, because it's developed over that time very, very organically.
And I think some of it comes down to also how organizations develop their so something I realized you have things in your career that I wish I'd realized earlier. So I had a thing that I went through at Credit Suisse. I kind of went through I realized there was something going on, and I basically decided that what I would start doing is I would not do what I'd been told to do. And I was a contractor this time. So just not doing your job as a contractor was a moderately
risky
thing. Risky thing. So I stopped doing my job and I went off and I basically wrote a board paper that was I think it was, looking back, was really, really good, of why I thought there was a challenge in a certain area, what the data was, and what we could do about it. So it was all the positive solution. I went off, did it for 2 weeks. My boss was kind of like, what have you been doing for the last 2 weeks? And really, I'm the best people I've ever worked with, loads of trust. So I was kind of like, I've done this. And he turned around to me and he said, who told you to do that? And I kind of went, I've just done it myself. I thought, anyway, this is amazing. And then over the course of a few days, it kind of went up and up and up, and more senior. And first thing everyone said is, who's told him to do this? And then they all just went, he's done it himself. And as weird as it sounds, I think something snapped in my brain at that point. I wish it happened earlier. And since then, I've realized I'm not hired for a job. I don't think we want to get people to realize they're not hired for their job. They're hired because they're them, if that makes sense. And I think actually the best people are the ones that turn around and go, well, there's a core need for some of the stuff in there, but actually I'm going to add value into the thing that I'm best at. And I think the more that you can help organizations grow in that way and take that as the underlying desire of the organization, the better. Valve are really interesting. Have you come across them? I don't know.
No.
So they are fantastic. You can read their company handbook online. They're the people behind Half-Life and Steam, the PC gaming platform. They've taken that to the absolute nth degree. So you get hired. You don't even get hired for a job there. You just get hired to join Valve. You join it. It's all in person. You have a desk on wheels. You sit there and you're told to just wheel your desk over to where you think you add value. Work with that team. No one has any job titles. I mean, this is like a multi-billion, like huge company. No one has your job titles. You wheel your desk over. You work with those people. If you think that you can work on something better, wheel your desk over there. And so it's this really like, whether that would work in a lot of other places, I mean, you could argue maybe not. But I think the more that you hire really good people and give them flexibility to excel at what they want to excel at. And I think that works, one, because the more agency someone feels they have, the better they do at it. And two, the only real challenge in life is to try and work out yourself. Like, you're never going to understand anyone else, but you can understand yourself. And so the more you have that ability to do so and kind of add value, but how that fits with, this is where how that fits with the job specs is probably slightly harder.
That's a conversation for next time. I'm very conscious of your time. Cool. I could talk to you for days.
I can chat for ages.
And I'd love to. So I think we definitely have to do it again. But on that note, yes, bring the best people in and let them add value where they're going to excel.
Yeah, thank you. I do think actually it's such an important thing. Like, effectively, people like yourself, like matching skilled people to companies that need it. That's really what keeps the world going. Like, I think people don't quite understand it. So thank you.
Well, thank you.